Stephen Watkins has arrived at his in-laws' house to pick up his daughter for a court-ordered visitation. He's involved in a bitter divorce and custody dispute with his estranged wife, but the court has ordered that he be allowed unsupervised visits with his daughter. He's a true family man, so he eagerly looks forward to seeing his daughter. But he's not sure what he'll encounter when he arrives, since the family has disallowed him from seeing his baby on numerous past visits. But this visit would sadly be much worse than that.
911, where's your emergency?
Yes, I called 911. My grandmother is having heart problems. My husband came after us and he's dead on the floor.
Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning until well after other reporting ends. Today, we will not be talking about a sweet old grandma and a straightforward murder. We sometimes worry that we'll run out of intriguing cases that make you stop and do a serious double take. Then, we land on cases like this one. So buckle up. This case is a roller coaster of a ride from start to finish. And before we get started, if you like how we present this case, please help us out by hitting like and subscribe, and hopefully share as well. We appreciate you. Let's go. Stephen Paul Watkins was born on February 7, 1976 in Beardstown, Illinois, to parents Dale and Penny Watkins. The couple also had a daughter, Stephen's sister, Ashley. Growing up in rural Chandlerville, Illinois, population 500, everyone knew Stephen to be a really great guy. He was genuinely kind to everyone and always looked out for people. Stephen loved family and was eager to start a family of his own someday. His mother noted how he was always the one who would be holding his younger cousins and looking after them. After high school, Stephen decided that he wanted to see the world beyond Chandlerville. So he joined the Coast Guard and planned to head off to Virginia. But that wouldn't be the only new adventure in his life. Stephen's ex-girlfriend was pregnant, and before he left, their daughter Alexandria, or Alex, was born. Stephen was all in when she was born and doted over every little thing about his new baby. His mother recalled how he would sleep right next to baby Alex's bed, holding her tiny little hand. Once Stephen was stationed in Virginia, his ex-girlfriend would bring Alex to visit him. Then, after several visits, the mother decided that Stephen could care for Alex better than she could, so she gave him full custody of the child. Alex moved in with Stephen full-time when she was 2 years old. Although challenging, Stephen thrived at being a single father to his precious daughter. After he completed his Coast Guard service, the two of them returned home to Illinois to resume their lives. It was after moving back home that Stephen met Jennifer Webster. Jennifer was pretty, bright, friendly, and came from a well-established religious family. Her family owned their own pallet and forest products company in town and were said to be financially successful. Jennifer's grandmother, Shirley Skinner, who was described as a gracious Christian woman, was said to have once owned her own daycare center. The family was extremely close-knit. So close, in fact, that multiple generations of the family lived in the same large house on Horseshoe Drive in Ashland, Illinois, a small farming town just 20 miles northwest of Springfield. The entire family got together every single night for 15 years to eat supper together. Stephen and Jennifer worked in nearby buildings, Stephen for the State Department of Health and Jennifer for AT&T. The two buildings shared a parking lot, and they would both park there. After admiring Jennifer from afar, Stephen finally worked up the courage to ask her out. Once he did, the pair began dating and their relationship took off fast. Just weeks after they began dating, the couple tied the knot in August of 2006. They bought a house on Horseshoe Drive just down the street from where Jennifer's parents and grandparents lived in Ashland and 30 minutes away from Stephen's family. Shortly after that, the couple announced that Jennifer was pregnant. They would soon welcome a new baby together. But the relationship began to fall apart almost as quickly as it came together. Stephen told his parents that Jennifer's family, who had once happily embraced his daughter Alex, made it clear that she would never be part of their family, even telling her so directly. And in general, he said that Jennifer and her family treated him like an outsider. The friction between the pair continued to grow, even as they welcomed their new baby in the summer of 2007. They named her Sydney. After the baby was born, Stephen's mother recalled how Jennifer wanted her and her family to be part of Sydney's life, to the exclusion of everyone else, including Stephen. Stephen shared with his mother that he barely got to see his own baby. Every day after work, Jennifer would take the baby to her parents' house and stay until 9:30 or 10 p.m., only returning home when it was time to go to bed. Stephen realized that the only way he might get time with his daughter was by divorcing Jennifer and getting court-ordered visitation. So, after less than 2 years of marriage, he filed for divorce. The same day that Jennifer found out that Stephen had filed for divorce, she called the state's child welfare agency and accused Stephen of sexually abusing both of his daughters, a claim that a state investigation would later rule was unfounded. As the divorce proceeded, Stephen, who was fighting for full custody, was granted regular visits with his daughter. But the Skinner family often prevented those visits from happening, telling Stephen that Sydney was sick. Jennifer's mother even claimed that Sydney would wet her pants and cry whenever her father came for a visit. Stephen had learned the hard way that the Skinner family was a closed unit, or as some neighbors described, clannish. They typically did not allow outsiders into their circle, and now that they had sweet baby Sydney, they had no more use for Stephen, and were annoyed by his insistence on being part of Sydney's life. With the Skinner family denying Stephen his court-ordered visits, he had the police accompany him on one of his planned visits. When they arrived, 2 male family members answered the door, telling them that the baby wasn't there. They were forced to leave without her.
Stephen was very calm and cool the whole time. When I met with him before and after, he said that, "Larry, all I want to do is see my daughter. That's all I'm here for. I'm not wanting to cause any problems with them. All I want to do is see my daughter." I told Stephen that after talking to the men and how angry they were towards him, I told him that when he came back that I would have someone with him for his benefit in case something should go on at that time.
And then Stephen would make his final attempt.
911, where's your emergency?
Yes, I called 911. My grandmother is having heart problems. My husband came after us, and he's dead on the floor, and no one is here yet.
Okay, I've got the ambulance on the way. Can you tell me what happened?
Yes, I told you guys before. He come in and was mad that we weren't ready. And Sydney had thrown up, and we told him that she couldn't go, and so he pushed my grandmother out of the way and then come after my daughter and I. And then he shot. Oh.
Police arrive on the scene, not certain what they'll find. The caller stated that Stephen had been shot, but that the grandmother needed attention. Emergency medical personnel arrived to find Stephen lying on the floor, having clearly been shot in the head. Emergency responders asked the distraught grandmother, Shirley Skinner, what happened. She responds, "Is he dead? I shot him. He shouldn't have come back here." The city's police chief, Jim Birdsell, arrived and asked Jennifer what happened. She said that Stephen forced his way into the house, knocked his grandmother down, and was coming after her and baby Sydney when her grandmother shot him. So the police chief went to get a statement directly from the grandmother. But when he went to ask her what happened, she had already lawyered up. She was talking with her lawyer on the phone, who advised her not to talk to anyone. Shortly after that, Jennifer also obtained an attorney and also stopped talking. Her grandfather, Kenneth Skinner, who was in another room of the home at the time watching television, was not talking as well. With everyone who was present in the house at the time of the murder refusing to talk, police investigated the scene, but were left to unravel the complicated mystery on their own. Based on the grandmother's appearance and their investigation of the home, they didn't find any evidence that Shirley Skinner had been shoved. Stephen Watkins had been shot one time in the back of the head, and he was not armed. With the small town having typically dealt with petty crimes, the police chief had never actually conducted a homicide investigation prior to that. He tried handling the investigation himself, but the case just dragged on for months with seemingly little progress and no arrests, until he finally called in state investigators to take over the case. But by then, precious time had passed, as well as numerous missed opportunities. Beyond the initial investigation of the scene, police had little to no forensic evidence to help them determine what had taken place. No gunshot residue tests were conducted on the family members. No blood spatter tests were performed. There were no recorded statements, and there were no fingerprints. They were able to ultimately test DNA on the weapon, but the results were not definitive. Birdsell, along with 3 first responders, did recall seeing 2 parallel scratches on the webbing of Shirley's hand that drew blood, consistent with marks that would have been made when firing the type of weapon used if she was holding it improperly. But they did not take any photos. Once the Illinois State Police were brought in to take over the investigation, the family dynamics that were at the center of it all began to surface. It was no secret that the Skinner family was a closed unit. Outsiders were just that, and they preferred it that way. According to Jennifer's uncle, Ed Skinner, Jennifer was spoiled rotten. Whatever Jennifer wanted, she got. The world revolved around her, and she and her grandmother were extremely close. Law enforcement looked into Jennifer's first marriage and found that it didn't last long either. Her former husband had divorced her, citing the us versus them mentality, noting that he and any others were shunned from her family. On the day of the murder, Stephen was scheduled for a court-ordered visit with Sydney. It was also the day before he and Jennifer were scheduled for a court hearing to discuss increased visitations for Stephen. That morning, Jennifer's mother, Deborah Webster, had hired a private investigator to come to the Skinner home to observe Stephen picking up Sydney. With Stephen fighting for full custody of Sydney, the Skinners were worried that Stephen would be awarded overnight visitations during the hearing the next day. With Deborah claiming that Sydney would cry and wet her pants when her father would pick her up for visits, they had hoped that the private investigator would perhaps observe something during the pickup that they could use against him at the hearing. But shortly prior to the pickup, Deborah told the private investigator to not come. She said the reason she canceled was because a child psychologist told her that any such third-party observations would not make a difference in the custody fight. Stephen arrived at the Skinner home to pick up Sydney. That part is undisputed, but everything beyond that point is subject to who you ask. In general, the Skinner family would later contend that the shooting was self-defense, but authorities believe that Stephen showed up for his court-ordered visit, was likely told he could not have the baby, possibly using the excuse of her being sick again. He likely protested, saying it wasn't true. They may have invited him in to check for himself, at which time, as he turned to head toward the room where the baby was, shortly grabbed the 9mm handgun from a shelf above a television and gunned Stephen down as he walked away from her at a distance of 15 to 20 feet. Not at all consistent with a self-defense scenario. No one tried to administer help to the 32-year-old father after he was shot. He lay face down where he fell. Once emergency responders and Chief Birdsell arrived on the scene and everyone clammed up, the only statements they were left with were the few admissions that Shirley had made to emergency responders and the statements that Jennifer had made to 911. With Shirley's admissions, it seemed like a straightforward case. But was it? People had their suspicions. The story was heavily covered in the local news, and residents had their own theories about who actually pulled the trigger, pondering whether Jennifer was the actual shooter and not her grandmother. The public was split in their speculation. Jennifer's uncle, Ed, was one of those people who speculated, but he was much closer to everyone involved than the average onlooker. He strongly felt that Jennifer had shot Stephen herself, or convinced her grandmother to do it for her. Why? For starters, he knew all too well the family dynamics that were at play, namely Shirley's willingness to cater to whatever Jennifer wanted. He said that there was nothing that Jennifer could ask for that she didn't get. And from many people's perspectives, based on what was coming to the surface, Jennifer did indeed have far more motivation to kill Stephen than her grandmother, including the weapon used to kill Stephen actually belonged to Jennifer, not Shirley. Jennifer stood to gain the most if her estranged husband were to die, including custody of their daughter. While the DNA on the gun was found to definitely not be Shirley Skinner's, results could not rule out the possibility of it being Jennifer's. And then there was the 911 call. In it, Jennifer can be heard clearly stating,
He come in and was mad that we weren't ready, and Sydney had thrown up and we told him that she couldn't go, and
implying that she was directly involved in the confrontation with her estranged husband. But she would later tell authorities that she was in another room when the shooting took place and only overheard the confrontation, directly contradicting what she said in the call.
I heard the doors slam open and I heard my grandmother's talking back and forth, and honestly, I didn't know who it was at first. And I heard her screaming, "Stop, stop," and then I heard a pop. And that's all I heard. I mean, it was a matter of seconds.
But evidence pointing towards Shirley Skinner was compelling as well. Starting with the scrapes the officers and first responders noticed on the webbing of Shirley's hand. Since they were consistent with firing the type of weapon used if it was held improperly, investigators felt that conclusively put the gun in Shirley's hand. And of course, there were her damning statements. Early on, Shirley readily acknowledged that she was the shooter. Oh, and there's one more thing. One of Shirley's employees reported that about 1 month before the murder, Shirley offered him and another employee $10,000 if they would cap or kill someone. When they asked if she was joking, she replied that she was serious. The second employee said that he had memory issues, and while he didn't deny that the solicitation took place, said he didn't recall it. The employee who did recall it said he still thought that she was joking despite her saying she was serious. But that didn't matter. The solicitation itself was enough. Stephen's mother, Penny Watkins, had no doubt that Shirley had killed her son, but she felt that there were other people involved. Regarding the claim that her son attacked the grandmother, she stated, "Lies, my son was never aggressive toward anyone. And self-defense? You don't shoot somebody in the back of the head when they're walking away." And the authorities agreed. Despite the claims of self-defense, investigators believed that Shirley Skinner had executed Stephen Watkins in cold blood. Their findings were enough to have an arrest warrant issued for her arrest. But arresting her wouldn't be as easy as they thought. After the investigation had gotten underway, Shirley and Jennifer were not sticking around for everyone to figure out what happened. Despite having generations of the family in the Ashland home, Jennifer and her grandparents packed up baby Sydney, and the four of them moved to Florida. That made it harder for law enforcement, but it didn't stop them. 10 months after Stephen was murdered, authorities arrested Shirley Skinner and charged her with 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of solicitation of murder. Prosecutors offered Skinner a reduced bond to allow her to potentially be free pending trial, on the condition that Jennifer allow Sydney visits with Stephen's parents 1 day per week. But according to Uncle Ed, Jennifer blew up and refused. So, her 73-year-old grandmother remained in jail until her trial. With all of the pre-trial publicity, the trial was moved to a different county. Shirley Skinner's trial began on May 3, 2010. Jennifer Watkins did not attend the trial. Throughout the trial, it was clear that the Skinner family had no love for Stephen. Without any reasonable explanation presented about why they hated him, one juror asked directly why the family had such animosity towards Stephen. Stephen's mother testified that she felt the family disliked Stephen because he would not conform to their way of life, daring to not live, eat, and spend all his time with them, and instead opting to also spend time outside the family, including with his other daughter, Alex, and other family members outside the Skinners. Jennifer's Uncle Ed would later also reveal that the family didn't approve of Stephen's family's way of life, including drinking and smoking. The prosecution presented their view that the Skinners considered Sydney their property and they weren't willing to share their property with anyone outside the Skinner family, not even the child's father. They cited Shirley's admission to first responders that she shot Stephen along with her other statements. The prosecutor argued that Steve Watkins was executed, shot in the back of the head. Regarding Shirley Skinner, he claimed, "She's not a fine Christian woman. She's selfish as the rest of her family." But Shirley's defense attorney suggested that someone else shot Stephen Watkins and that the admissions were made by an elderly woman experiencing heart distress. They made the risky decision of not pursuing a self-defense claim and instead focused on the police not having enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that their client was guilty. They pointed to the sloppy police work, noted that there was no physical evidence tying his client to the murder, and argued that Jennifer was the person with the most to gain from killing Stephen. And with almost no forensic evidence linking the vulnerable-looking religious matriarchs to the shooting, it did indeed appear that the prosecution didn't stand a chance. The defense was so confident that Shirley did not take the stand, and they did not call any witnesses. The prosecution knew the physical case against this sympathy-inducing grandmother looked bleak. They had known it from the very beginning. So much so that back before the trial even began, they had offered her a plea deal of serving 10 years in prison. She had turned it down, opting to take her chances on a trial. It turned out to be a bad call. On May 6, 2010, after less than a week-long trial and 90 minutes of deliberation, including lunch, the jury found 75-year-old Shirley Skinner guilty of all charges. She was sentenced to 55 years in prison for the murder conviction, plus 15 years for the solicitation. Had she taken the plea deal, she would have been out in less than 9 years. The family was shocked by the verdict, including Uncle Ed. They felt the police had botched the investigation, and had they done a thorough job, the grandmother's claim of self-defense could have been proven. Deborah Webster remarked that she thought it would be at least a hung jury. Everyone knew that the 70-year sentence would mean that Shirley Skinner would die in prison, but the judge insisted that the case was not a minimum sentence case. He said, "I don't want my signature on a 20-year sentence." During sentencing, he also addressed Shirley. "I can't imagine what his two daughters are going to think of you, Mrs. Skinner, that you took their father's life." After hearing all the evidence of how devoted, upstanding, and non-confrontational Stephen was, the judge also remarked, "He obviously was a really good guy who tried to keep things calm and play by the rules." And again to Shirley, "You call yourself the matriarch of the family, but you go out the back door with an 18-month-old when her father comes for a legal visit," he scolded. Shirley Skinner was headed to prison. And if you thought that was the end of the story, think again. The Skinner family was just getting warmed up. So sit tight for today's roller coaster of a Z section. At the end of 2010, 2 years after the shooting, and just a handful of months after Shirley Skinner was sentenced, a grand jury hearing was convened to further probe the shooting death of Stephen Watkins. With all the relatives having invoked their Fifth Amendment rights to remain silent during previous grand jury proceedings, they suddenly decided it was time to speak. They claimed they had wanted to speak out, but had been advised by their attorneys not to do so. Shirley's husband, as well as Jennifer's mother and her husband, all testified that the state had identified the correct shooter, Shirley Skinner, but that she had acted in self-defense and should be freed. Deborah Skinner testified that, "I would not let my mother take the rap for my daughter. If my daughter did it, her butt would be in there, not my mother." Jennifer's uncle attended the hearing but did not speak to the rest of the family. Shirley's husband, Kenneth, commented regarding Ed. "There goes Eddie. He's going to try his best to make it look like his mom," referring to Shirley, "didn't do it, but we know better." And Jennifer Watkins, who had also refused to testify up until that point, testified under a grant of immunity. After the hearing, the special prosecutors said that he did not expect to file any additional charges against anyone else. As of the making of this video in 2024, no one else has ever been charged, nor is there any indication that anyone else ever will be. Toward the end of 2010, Stephen Watkins' family filed a wrongful death suit against Jennifer Watkins and her family on behalf of Sydney and Alexandria. They alleged that the Skinner family conspired to murder Stephen and destroy evidence that could have helped prove that Stephen Watkins did not force his way into the Skinner home, including burning clothing they wore the night of the murder, getting rid of evidence, including carpeting from the spot of the shooting and a broken sconce. After the killing, Jennifer and Shirley fled to Florida and would not divulge their location. As Stephen's wife, Jennifer had a financial motive to participate in the killing, and they claimed that the family conspired to murder Stephen to ensure that they would get sole custody of Sydney. Other than seeking reimbursement of medical, funeral, and legal expenses, the Watkins did not seek any other damages, and according to their lawyer, wanted to learn the entire truth about what happened. The case was settled by an insurance company in 2014, with each of Stephen's children receiving just over $23,000. And before 2010 came to a close, Stephen's parents were awarded visitation of their granddaughter, Sydney, under the grandparent visitation statute. The judge who awarded the visitation commented, "There is an evil in Jennifer Watkins that I do not understand. It is an evil that is going to harm this little girl unless Dale and Penny Watkins are granted visitation. Without meaningful visitation, the court is absolutely convinced that mental or emotional harm will come to this little girl." When Jennifer asked the judge to delay the visits, he flatly denied her request, remarking, "I feel sorry for Sydney, primarily because she lives with you." But Jennifer had no intention of Sydney's grandparents having regular visitations. She allowed a handful of visits, but within a month of the ruling, she moved to Florida with Sydney again. So in March of 2011, Jennifer Watkins was arrested. Florida law enforcement had picked her up for failing to allow the court-ordered visitations, while Illinois authorities attempted to extradite her back to Illinois. She posted bond, but was arrested again the following month. Illinois authorities were unsuccessful at extraditing her back to their state, and Jennifer was eventually freed after 5 months in jail. 2 years later, in 2013, Illinois authorities issued another warrant for her arrest. Florida police attempted to execute it on several occasions, but each time either no one answered the door or they were told that she didn't live there. She remained in Florida for years before moving to Massachusetts in the summer of 2016. Once there, Jennifer was promptly arrested again on a fugitive from justice charge. Sydney was sent to live with her aunt, Stephen's sister Ashley, and her family. Jennifer was able to post a $5,000 bond after a week in jail, so she was released on the condition that she clear up her warrant in Illinois within 2 weeks. That meant facing the Illinois court system again. She wanted her daughter back, but she needed funds to fight. Amidst all the arrests and custody hearings, Jennifer met and got engaged to Frederick Thomas Giampa, who Jennifer called Tom. They met at their Seventh-day Adventist church, and Tom had his own share of legal and financial woes. Although he had donated more than $17,000 to the church in 2010, he filed bankruptcy that same year. He had also been previously suspected in a murder-for-hire plot, pleaded guilty in a $175 million fraud scheme, and was named in several other fraud lawsuits. There was even a criminal investigation into his involvement in a murder attempt against the lead attorney of an insurance company suing him. Jennifer's association with such a questionable companion would not help her custody battle. She claimed to have broken things off with him once their relationship was discovered. After filing a motion for full custody in November of 2016, Jennifer Watkins, now going by her maiden name of Jennifer Webster, created a GoFundMe page called Bring Sydney Home. She was trying to raise $35,000 for her legal expenses and court-ordered psychological exams. She wrote, "Every mother in the world should know about this case and be concerned. If this can happen to me, this can happen to anyone." She then goes on to disparage the judge who granted the grandparents' visitation, stating that he is a small-town judge who is very good friends with the grandparents. The judge is using Sydney to get back at me for not following his mandate grandparent visitation orders. Grandparents who won't spend any time with Sydney. This is why he jailed me and why he continues his vindictiveness on me. She also claims that Sydney cries herself to sleep each night and has been forced to sleep on a floor. The Watkins refuted each of the claims Jennifer made, noting that Sydney was living a happy, normal childhood. Jennifer's custody hearing, where she was fighting for full custody, did not go well for her. Sydney shared how her mother told her to say that she cries every night to go home to her mother and was forced to sleep on the floor. Sydney also shared with the court that she preferred to stay with her Aunt Ashley and her family. Jennifer spent several minutes apologizing for her past actions, trying to convince the judge that she was a changed person who now realized that what she'd done was wrong, even choking up as she spoke. Spectators watched stone-faced, as did the judge. Jennifer asked if she could be granted unsupervised visits, since the supervised visits she was currently granted were costing her $140 per session. He responded, "I'm not going to do that today." Instead, he ruled that Jennifer had neglected her daughter by denying her grandparent visitations. Stephen's sister, Ashley, would be granted permanent guardianship of Sydney, and the only contact Jennifer would have with her from that point on would be supervised visits and phone calls. The following year, Jennifer would sign over custody to Ashley to avoid risking losing her parental rights entirely. Jennifer continues to have a supervised visit every other week. In 2011, the Court of Appeals overturned Shirley Skinner's solicitation of murder conviction, calling the testimony of the employee who Skinner allegedly solicited equivocal and vague. Her murder conviction and the 55-year sentence associated with it was upheld. In January 2014, 4 years after she was sentenced, 78-year-old Shirley Skinner submitted a petition for clemency, citing her deteriorating health. During the resulting hearing, Shirley's daughter said that her mother has had 3 strokes in prison, resulting in a fall and concussion each time. She also claimed that her mother has broken her arm, has been on heart medication, and has had several bouts of cancer. She also shared that the family is deeply sorry for the pain the incident caused and said that the family, including Shirley, asks for forgiveness daily. Shirley's 81-year-old husband pleaded, "Shirley is the love of my life. It's just been hard on me. I'm not used to living by myself." Skinner's representation argued that she is 78 years old, is sick, and is no threat to anyone. She requested that she simply be allowed to go home to be with her husband of over 60 years. The Watkins family was there to object to the clemency. A special prosecutor representing them noted that any health concerns that have arisen since Skinner was incarcerated have been addressed by the Department of Corrections. Stephen's mother was skeptical about Skinner's health claims and suggested they were exaggerated to evoke sympathy. She noted that Shirley had never offered any apology or displayed any remorse to the Watkins family. She said that the first she had ever heard any member of the Skinner family express remorse was during that very hearing. She testified, "I know Shirley's elderly. I know she's sick. She was that way 5 years ago when she murdered my son. She didn't give him any mercy. She should get the same sentence Stephen did. Life with no mercy." Stephen's 14-year-old daughter, Alex, also pleaded to reject Skinner's clemency. She said, "It's easier knowing that the person who forced me to live without my father is also living without her loved ones." With Skinner having already exhausted all her state appeals and petitions, which were either denied or dismissed, the clemency petition would likely be her last option for getting out of prison. Shirley Skinner's petition for clemency was denied. So, unless extenuating circumstances arise, Shirley Skinner, now in her late 80s and incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center in Broadwell Township, will not be released prior to her projected parole date in 2064, at which time she would be 129 years old. Next up, Jennifer's mother, Shirley's daughter, Deborah Webster. The morning after she spoke at her mother's clemency hearing, Deborah, too, was arrested for allegedly failing to pay the family's legal bills. Back in 2011, the law firm that the family used sued and won judgment against Deborah, her husband, and Jennifer for failing to pay over $20,000 in outstanding legal bills. It's unclear why it took years to apprehend Deborah and why the others were not arrested. But Deborah was released after posting bond. Then, a few days after that, still only a week after the clemency hearing, Shirley Skinner decided to go public and finally speak up. Many felt in an attempt to sway the clemency board's deliberations.
I've wanted to tell my story for 4 years. I see that I made a big mistake, I should have got up on the witness stand and I should have told them everything that I just told you. Oh, I regret that to my dying day. I should have got up and told it all. But I didn't. Because why? Because I had a bad lawyer. And I'll always believe that. He shouldn't have told me to take the fifth.
But even though 6 years had passed since the murders, Skinner still had credibility issues, including when she described how the visitation on the evening of the murder was planned to take place.
The policeman in Ashland told him to sit out there, and we would bring the baby to him.
But when told about her statement, the police officer she was referring to unequivocally refuted her claim.
That's absolutely not true.
Are you sorry Steve's dead?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yep, I am. I didn't like the things he'd done, but I can see that I wished we'd have done different things.
She extended an apology to the family.
I'd like to tell him that I'm sorry.
And specifically to Alex.
I would love her and tell her that I was very sorry for what I'd done to her dad. And I would never do anything to hurt her. I know I have, and I'm sorry. And I hope someday she can forgive me. I don't know if she ever can, but at least I'm asking.
She's had 6 years, never offered an apology. She was ordered in 2010 to make financial restitution to the family for the expenses we've paid. We've not seen anything. We've not seen a letter of regret. We've not seen an apology. We've not seen a dime of restitution. She hasn't even wrote Alex an "I'm sorry." Not one person in that family has ever said "I'm sorry" until at Shirley's clemency hearing.
In the summer of 2013, the Skinner family's pallet company closed down. And the following year, the home where 4 generations of the Skinner family had been living during the shooting went into foreclosure. Kenneth Skinner had moved out a few months prior to that and moved in with his son Ed, who didn't want his father living alone. As a result of Stephen's murder, the Stephen Watkins Memorial Act was passed. It targets parents who deny visitation rights to the non-custodial parent, putting in place strong penalties like suspending the violator's driver's license, monetary fines, and even jail time.
I have to honestly say, I believe anyone in that family was capable of murdering him and would have. I believe that Shirley was the one that they chose to do the deed because she was old and elderly and sickly, and nobody would believe little old Granny would have done it.
We'd hope this video did justice to Stephen Watkins, whose life was taken for simply loving his family. What are your thoughts about this case and the people involved? Do you think Shirley Skinner should be released because she is, as her representation claimed, no longer a threat to anyone? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like how we presented this case, we'd really appreciate you hitting like and most definitely hit subscribe so that you never miss a single video.